thank you for coming to Walnut Creek Preserve. You made a presentation. You do a presentation here once a month. Thanks to Pacolet. And today's presentation is being on educational experience. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary Walker and introduce you to them. Thank you.
Welcome everybody. We're so glad you could come to this beautiful place, this beautiful morning. I want to introduce our speaker, Dennis Chastain. He is an outdoors writer. He has been hunting, hiking, and fishing in the area for more than 30 years. He's a regular contributor to Chastain magazine. And I think you passed out some copies to anybody. He's in there all the time. Fascinating person with a real curious mind, and so we're just real happy to have you, Dennis. Thanks for coming.
Well, thanks, Mary. And let me tell you, first of all, that I'm hopefully toward the end of laryngitis. When I talked to Mary on the phone last week, it was just barely a whisper. And so I may go from baritone to falsetto and then back up to baritone, but we'll get through it. As Mary said, I've been writing for South Carolina Wildlife Magazine since 1989. And I've had some wonderful experiences, had opportunities to go to places that maybe other folks won't ever get to go. This is my wife, Jane. She's not only my IT expert and is responsible for actually having the thing up on the screen. She's retired from teaching kindergarten for 34 years. And about, I guess, 6 or 8 years ago now, having been a writer for a long time, I kept running across references to something called the Cherokee Path. And the references were pretty compelling. Apparently this Cherokee Path ran all the way from modern day downtown Charleston to Fort Loudon in Tennessee, way up into Tennessee, near Maryville and Knoxville in that area. And the accounts that I kept running across were of troops of 1,500 soldiers and the royal Governor James Glenn, trooping up and down this Cherokee Path in the 1700s. And I thought, how could this be possible? Because being a lifelong South Carolinian, I know what's between the mountains of South Carolina, where we live, and Charleston. A lot of different kinds of territories, swamps and huge rivers and all this. How could this possibly be? So I talked to the editor of the magazine, and I said, David Lucas is the editor at the time. I said, David, I don't know where this story's headed, but it appears to be a good story. I said, Jane is about to retire. We're going to, at our own expense, we're going to go down the coast and work our way back up and see what we can find of this old Cherokee Path. And where do you start that kind of research? I got on the internet, and I just Googled Cherokee Path. Well, it turns out there's this fellow, Roy Vandergriff III. And when you get to know him, you understand the third is really important, who had done a fair amount of work. He had identified several sections of this old road from the 1700s that were still out there, which just amazed me. The same road that Governor James Glenn in 1765 took 1,500 troops and men and material and wagons, and they even carried cattle along with them as a food source. They'd stop, every 30, 40 miles and kill a cow and sit down and have lunch, and pack up and move on a little bit farther. And so he's saying, yeah, there's some sections out there. Well, I never could get in touch with the fellow. Never could figure out exactly where he lived, because I'd find references to him having spoken to a group here and there. Well, Jane and I were at the Saluda County Museum, a tiny little museum. Really, the whole museum's not much bigger than this room, but a wonderful lady in there. And I said, let me ask you something. I said, there's this mythical fellow, Roy Vandergriff III, and I've been trying to find out where he lives. Do you know anything about it? She said, oh yeah, he's at a funeral right across the street. I'll give him a call. So she whipped out her cell phone. She said, the funeral hadn't started. She calls him, and she said, Roy, I got somebody here in the museum that wants to talk to you. And he said, well, I got to go to the funeral, but I'll be right down there. So he does. He comes, and we set up a date, and he and his wife took us through the entire length of Saluda County, which is where he lived. and showed us every section that he knew where it was. And so, from those humble beginnings over the 4 summers when Jane was off school, and knows how many trips we made, this slideshow that you're going to see is a result of that. Now, it's probably longer than we can do this morning, but we will start where it entered South Carolina on the Chattooga River, and we will work downstream toward Charleston as far as we can. And being a kindergarten teacher, I don't know if you all were ever aware of this or not, but there was a character, I think there's a book called Flat Stanley, and Flat Stanley was a little cutout figure, and they'd send him all over the world. People would go on vacations, and they'd take Flat Stanley and stand him up by the Washington Monument and take a picture of him and all this, and send it back. Well, Jane plays the character Flat Stanley the entire thing. You will see her all the way from the Chattooga River to downtown Charleston. But one thing I with Wildlife Magazine is, if you want to make a picture interesting, put a person in it. You know, nature's great and wonderful, but you put a picture in it, all of a sudden people are interested. Who is that? What are they doing there? What? You know. So here we are. As a matter of fact, Jane and I just took this photo about 6 weeks ago because I had never photographed the point where the Cherokee Path actually crossed into South Carolina on the Chattooga River, and it's not easy to find. But we had a whole morning devoted to it and Google Earth maps, and we found it. And this is it. This is Earl's Ford on the Chattooga River. If you're at all familiar with the Chattooga River in South Carolina, you know where Mountain Rest community is in northern Oconee County? It's kind of west of there. Pretty remote, actually. This place where she is standing is the actual old road bed. And I'll show you in just a minute how we know that to be true. That's it. That's where she was standing. Right straight across, let me go back to here, is a creek that comes in over there. So we knew we were in the right place because all the historical references said the Cherokee Path crossed the Chattooga River at War Woman Creek. War Woman was Nancy Hart, who was a legendary figure among the Cherokees and addressed the Treaty of Hopewell. I think there was like 900 Indians of various tribes, and General Andrew Pickens and everybody big treaty. Nancy Hart was the leader of the Cherokees at that time, and that creek is named for her. And War Woman Creek is just out of your view right there. So this is the real deal. We know we're in the right place, and that is, you could see where it continues on in North Carolina right there. Maybe not so good in the slide, but it's very clearly an open road over there. I don't know how far it goes before it starts, you know, getting destroyed by development or whatever. This is War Woman Creek that I was talking about right there. So this is where everybody forded for about 250 years. There were people moving up and down the Cherokee Path. This is where most of the battles took place, and this is how we know we're in exactly the right place. Where you saw Jane standing there at the side of the river, this is only about 100 yards back up the logging road that now goes there. This is the old road bed. I stood down in the road bed, and Jane is standing up in the road. You can see how deep it is. We have found this all the way across the state. Wherever there is a section of the Cherokee Path left. Now remember, this road dates back to, well, Mary has brought a map here, the original map that was done in 1730. So if you put thousands of men, horses with shoes on, cattle, iron-rimmed wagons on sloped terrain, it pulverizes the soil every time they go over it. It rains, washes that away, next creek comes through, and eventually we have found it as, that's about head high right there. You can see I'm standing in the bottom of it, and actually it's deeper than my head. So it's about almost 6 feet deep there. This is the Earl's Ford sign there where you have to park. It's not very far, maybe 1/10 of a mile down there. Right before you get to Earl's Ford, by the way, those of you, I handed out wildlife magazines. Does everybody have one? Does anybody not have one? I interviewed a fellow who worked at the U.S. Forest Service Stump House Mountain Ranger Station, not very far from Mountain Rest, who had grown up near Earl's Ford. And that's how I first found out that's where it crossed the Chattooga River. And he mentioned that he lived near Village Creek, Village Creek, and there was a Village Creek church right there. And he said, if you can find that little church, he said the Cherokee Path went right in front of it. Well, lo and behold, 6 weeks ago when we were up there looking for Earl's Ford, we found the church. Now, it's not much, but they're obviously see there, Village Creek Church. They are a very active, proactive congregation. There's Cherokee Path coming in right behind the church, right behind the restroom. Thought I had a slide of the outhouse in there, but they actually have 2 outhouses, one for men and one for women, and I didn't go in because men just don't do that. That's what the woods are for, right? Men's restroom is on the left side of the logging road, women's restroom is on the right side of the logging road. So anyway, Jane goes in and she said, it's really nice in there. She said, for an outhouse, they've got room deodorizer, they have real Charmin bathroom tissue. So it's an up and coming church. Very proactive congregation we have here. After the Cherokee Path working its way toward Charleston left the Chattooga River and Village Creek Church, really the next landmark was a 1760s era frontier outpost. It eventually became a trading post, but it was one of those frontier forts. They were all over Spartanburg County. There was Fort Thickety and Fort Prince and Gowan Fort. These were, and the blockhouse near Tryon. These were frontier forts that were established by the colonial government as early as 1715. The reason that article is called The Key to Carolina is because probably more than any other colonial governor, Governor James Glenn, realized that, there's just a few of us and a lot of Indians. There were coastal tribes all up and down the coast. The Cherokees were the most powerful and most numerous among them, but there was a lot. They could have wiped the Europeans out just like that. And Governor James Glenn discovered 2 things. That first, the Cherokee Path, which already existed, but he started to improve very early on up to the kind of standards where you could get a wagon up as opposed to a man with deer skins on his back or maybe a horse. That improving the Cherokee Path was an important first step to establishing a relationship with these Indians, mostly the Cherokees, that were located in the backcountry or the interior. But he also described, and this is where the title of the article comes from, that the success or the failure of Carolina, meaning what is now North and South Carolina, was establishing a relationship with the Cherokees. It was do or die. If the colony did not establish a good working relationship with the Cherokees, it had no future. I've told people the French were coming in from Mississippi and had pretty much occupied, that's why they speak Cajun down in New Orleans. The French had pretty much occupied all of the Mississippi River Valley and were working over in this area and wooing the Cherokees. And I remember I told a reporter with the Greenville News one time, I was doing an article about Cherokee Path, and I said, if the Cherokees had allied with the French instead of the British, we'd all be having croissants for breakfast instead of grits. And we'd be wearing little black berets and have an attitude. So I'm glad it turned out the way it did, because I love grits. But anyway, the next thing you would encounter on the Cherokee Path coming in this direction is now called, and it may have been called that in colonial times, but one of these 2 buildings, and I'm not sure even the State Park Service is sure which one was the original outpost of colonial fort, which one was a trading post. But that is right off of Cherokee Foothills Scenic Highway near Walhalla. It's now a little miniature state park. That's really the only thing that's there. Next thing you run up on is, I have a new clicker and I have a real problem remembering which one's forward and which one's backward. Okay. Hopewell Church near Pendleton. This is right at Clemson University, is the site where General Andrew Pickens, who was not only a Revolutionary War hero, but also had numerous successful, for the most part, battles with the Cherokees. The Cherokee Wars occurred in the 1760s as sort of a preface to the American Revolution. Andrew Pickens was involved in both, and this was his grave. General Pickens buried here, and his wife, who had been a Calhoun, as in John C. Calhoun. I think he was John C. Calhoun's niece. There at Pendleton. Let me get this right. This is where General Pickens, Andrew Pickens' retirement home was, and it's on a knoll not very far from Oconee Station that I just showed you. I'm trying to think where I can fix. Have you ever been to Walhalla or know where Walhalla is? In this direction, and that'd be before you get to Walhalla, you start getting some really nice mountain views near Tomasi DAR School. And this is right near the Tomasi DAR School. And the reason I put it in the slideshows is Andrew Pickens chose this as his last home, the little house there. He had a huge plantation, Hopewell, down below Clemson. But when he got toward retirement years, he was too old to farm and all that. So he built this retirement home up near Tomasi Knob because he had fought what he described as his last and most desperate battle on Tomasi Creek, right in front of where this boulder. The DAR years ago put up a marker there where the house was. That's really all that's left. I think I have, yes, there's the marker and Tomasi Knob. Right down in front is Tomasi Creek, runs that little drainage right down through there. During the height of the Cherokee Wars, there was actually two phases of it. Andrew Pickens was leading a group of not very many militia, about 20, kind of on a scouting mission really to kind of gauge what effect they were having on the Cherokees overall. And they were coming up Tomasi Creek, just 20, and when you read in the historic literature militia, these are not trained soldiers. These are farmers and blacksmiths and folks who are willing, to fight for the cause, but they're not really trained military troops. General Pickens, on the other hand, by this time had achieved, a pretty fairly sophisticated. He got his generalship, honestly. He really was a military genius. Well, here he is out in the middle of nowhere with 20 militia troops. They get into this little drainage right down in here. It was a cane break, which means cane. I know there are a lot of botany people in here. This is a Rundinaria gigantea, the native river cane that grows. And when it grows, particularly historically, not so much these days, but it grows in these huge homogeneous stands, which were called cane breaks. Nothing but cane, isn't there? They were working their way through a cane break, which is, you can't see 20 feet in front of it. And all of a sudden, they start taking on fire from all directions. They're Indians in the cane and up in the woods and all around. And that's why he called it his last and most desperate fight. He said he actually didn't see any way to survive. It's called the ring fight. He put his men in a ring and told them just to shoot at will. Anything you think is a Cherokee, have at it. So they all get in a ring, and the fight's pretty hot. And I don't know where this idea came from, but he set the cane break on fire. And if you think about bamboo, it's a segmented stem. And those segments are all closed by a membrane. So when they burn, the moisture that's in there builds up, and like popcorn, it explodes. And I've actually put river cane in a brush fire I was burning, and you jump back because it goes pow, 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 and it sounds like firecrackers or gunfire. Well, number one, the smoke from the fire confused the Cherokees. They weren't sure where all the Andrew Pickens' men were, but they'd also convinced them there was a whole lot more of them than they thought. So they eventually just kind of dissipated, and that really, honestly, it's easy to see how that would have been a total massacre. So that's why Andrew Pickens said, you know what, this is a pretty special place, and that's where where he died, right there near that rock. Very near, actually, Tomasi Knob there, on Highway 11, is really the only indication that you would ever have that this Cherokee Path crossed through this area, right on Highway 11. I think this one talks about, yeah, in 1776, for the botany folks in here, William Bartram came up the Cherokee Path in 1776, very near this area. He turned west. If you've ever been down the Cherokee Foothill Scenic Highway heading toward Walhalla, you know you cross Lake Kiowee, really beautiful vistas there. That's the old Kiowee River under there. And both Andre Michaud, the French botanist who discovered Oconee bells, and William Bartram came up the Savannah River, then the Kiowee River, and then turned west and went up into the area of Highlands and Cashers and that area like that. So there's been more than Indians and colonial governors going up and down the Cherokee Path. One of the most important locations on the Cherokee Path, certainly in northwestern South Carolina, was two things really. An ancient Cherokee village, which was considered the capital of the lower towns of the Cherokees. Like I say, the Cherokees were a huge, really a nation. That's why they call them the nation. They considered most of Virginia, about half of South Carolina, and about half of Georgia, and much of eastern Tennessee as their territory, and defended it actively. The Broad River was their dividing line between the Catawbas, who they were mortal enemies with the Catawbas, and the Creeks on the other side. Well, their principal town was Kiowee Town. It is now under Lake Kiowee, and hardly anybody ever gets to see this marker put up here because it's out there in the middle of the woods and there's no indication it's there. It's one of those things you'd never know it was there unless you knew it was there. But you've seen it now. When Duke Power announced back in the late 60s that they were going to build the Kiowee Toxaway project, which includes Lake Jocassee, Lake Kiowee, and Oconee Nuclear Station, a lot of these historic resources like Kiowee Town, Indian Village, and a number of other Cherokee villages up and down the Kiowee River, and the old colonial Fort Prince George were all going to be inundated. So they gave archaeologists about a year to go in and excavate what they could. And one of the archaeologists that excavated Fort Prince George, the colonial frontier fort directly across the Kiowee River from the Indian village Kiowee, actually constructed this model out of balsa wood or whatever, and the dirt that's in the floor is soil that he took from the excavation. So it's actually soil from Fort Prince George. This is the spot on Lake Kiowee where Fort Prince George and the Kiowee Indian Village were located directly across from each other. It was a pretty typical frontier fort. That design was very common with 4 cannons, small bore cannons. One of the reasons the Cherokees desperately wanted the colonial government to build Fort Prince George because they thought it would impress their enemies, the Creeks and the Cherokees. I mean, you know, these big cannons are pretty impressive when they get fired off. So they not only sold Governor Glenn the land to build it, but they actually helped construct the fort. There's a wonderful story, and I believe it to be true, that a friend of mine who's a historian loves to tell. Attakulla, which means the English interpretation was little carpenter. We don't really know where that comes from, but that's what he was called. Attakulla was chief for the Cherokees in the lower towns at that time. He's the one who did the negotiating for the Cherokees on where to build this Fort Prince George. And so Governor Glenn comes all the way up from Charleston. They come up there on the Kiowee River, and it's a beautiful floodplain. And Attakulla says, I think you ought to build the fort right over there, right on the side of the river with all these beautiful rising knolls around here. You can grow your own corn here. There's plenty of water. And the governor says, yeah, looks good to me. Where do I sign? So they signed, so he sells him about 1,000 acres. What Attakulla didn't tell him was that once they got the fort built, his men could get up on these rising knolls. And one of the soldiers in the fort in his journal wrote that he feared for his life every morning because he said they could literally see the buckles on my shoes. So Attakulla was always thinking A little more about here's the actual excavation, which occurred, I think, in 1971. A lot of those artifacts still exist. Jane and I have picked up from where the Cherokee Path, this took a lot of detective work, but we have found where the Cherokee Path actually left the Kiowee River, not very far downstream from what I just showed you there, Fort Prince George and Kiowee Town. But this is an area called Gap Hill and Gap Hill Landing. There's a fishing boat ramp here. That's it right there, Gap Hill Landing. That's just outside the little town of 6 Mile. If you've ever been to Clemson via Highway 11, you probably went through 6 Mile on 137th. The reason 6 Mile is called 6 Mile is because there is a legend, and it is absolutely that, even though lots of folks in my area think it's true. This is real hard history. No, this is pure fiction. But there is a mythical, there's a story that Katichi, or Isaquina, she's called both names, in the 1760s during these Cherokee Wars, and there are lots of these stories of Indians and their lovers that were British soldiers and they try to save them, and that she got on her pony and rode all the way from Kiowee Town or Fort Prince George because she heard that Cherokees were going to attack Fort 96 down in Greenwood County and massacre everybody in there. So she gets on her pony and rides all night long, and she counts the streams as she goes along and counts the mileage. So there's a 1 mile creek, a 6 mile, and a 12 mile, and a 18 mile, and a 23 mile, and then Fort 96 she determined was 96 miles from Fort Kiowee. Well, here's the proof that that's not true. And Mary brought it this morning. This is George Hunter's map, the first map ever drawn of the Kiowee Path from all the way on the tip end of the Charleston Peninsula to Fort Loudon, 1730, 30 years before the Cherokee Wars. And you'll notice 2 numerals right here, 96, 96. It was called 96 30 years before Isaquina supposedly made her ride. Nevertheless, I don't argue with local historians because everybody loves a good myth and nobody likes a despoiler of myth. But I figure I'm over here in North Carolina. Y'all don't know me. You don't know my family. You don't know how to egg my house. So I can get away with that. Just above, now this is a real discovery for Jane and I. I had read numerous references, and with all due deference to Roy Vandergrift III, Roy had published widely on the internet and otherwise that the Battle of Gap Hill took place behind Gap Hill Baptist Church, which I guess if you didn't know better would make sense, and I'll show you Gap Hill Baptist Church in a minute, but there's no gap. There's no gap anywhere near. Jane and I started at Gap Hill Baptist Church based on Roy Vandergrift III's description, and sure enough, you can see down behind the church, there's the old roadbed. It's clearly the old Cherokee Path, but we started looking around, it's dead level flat. You could build a golf course there. And so we started out from there looking for a gap. Well, the historical reference says that what it was, the Battle of Gap Hill took place when the colonial forces were coming through a prominent gap in the mountains that the hump on a Bactrian camel. And the Cherokees got up on these ridges and shot down in there and just massacred them until, the British troops recovered and finally survived. First of all, I didn't know what a Bactrian camel was, so I had to go look that up. It turns out there are 2 kinds of camel. There's a dromedary camel, I think, that has 1 hump. That's the one you see most often. Then a Bactrian camel has 2 humps. So now you can envision 2 knolls and a prominent gap in between them. Well, lo and behold, Jane and I started walking right here from Gap Hill Landing. I asked the fellow who owns the landing, I said, look, I've got this historical reference that says not long after the Cherokee Path left the Kiowee River, it went through this Gap Hill. And I told him what I just told you about Roy Vandergrift III. And I said, I think that thing has to be up in here. Do you mind if I go up there?